So I'm going to talk about uh, my final project, and that is a analysis of the representations of H.P. Lovecraft in several different mediums. So H.P. Lovecraft was an author from the early 20th century, and he is best known for having been the progenitor of weird fiction. Um, I found what I found to be like super interesting about this project was its relation to okay, I can be honest, you all know me. I'm just obsessed with this guy. I've lectured on him for classes. I have uh, written tons of papers about him, and something I really want to do is I want to create a very large paper about H.P. Lovecraft using what I did last semester and this and additional things I will write after I graduate. Um, so so I really wanted to know how people look at him and how people see him, but well, that's where I started. But I moved more towards how does the author see himself. So I'm going to show you a picture of him. It's just this, just says H.P. Lovecraft, and that's what he looked like. He wasn't unattractive or particularly ugly or anything. He, he got married, and in letters from his wife, she said, you look. She really just said he was kind of average, but she didn't say he was ugly or anything like that. And that seems unrelated now, but I'll get into it later. So, H.P. Lovecraft is born in the late 1800s, and 2 years after he is born, at the cusp of the 20th century, his father, in 1893, goes mad from syphilis. He's taken to Butler Hospital, and there he spends the rest of his life. Lovecraft would then move in with his mother and her maternal grandfather. Now, this period is actually one of great growth, and you don't really see Lovecraft as missing the absent parent much. And I think this probably stems from the fact that he's two, and he knew his father for 2 years. He, in letters, he talks about things that he was doing at the age of 2 that shows he maintained an extremely strong long-term memory. So he does remember images of his father, but not anything prominent. And the grandfather took over the character's place. And so his mother oftentimes is seen, because she winds up going to Butler Hospital later, as having some sort of other distinct mental illness, which is unclear. But whenever she is brought in, a doctor says that it seems that this illness has been going on for about 23 years. During this period, between these periods, Lovecraft is in and out of school, because this is a period where you don't have to go to secondary education or primary education for that matter. And being of kind of semi-bourgeois housing, he's able to use his grandfather's immense library of 18th century, 1700s literature. And this is where he mainly educates himself. So it's on these kind of works like the Arabian Tales and these very classic stories that he's educated. And so he's not educated in the milieu of his time. So he is rather strange. He never completes high school, and this stems from a nervous breakdown that would then result in reclusion, which lasts about 4 years. This reclusion, it's not clear because we don't have the historical figure here to examine, but Lovecraft most likely entered into an immense and severe depressive episode for several years where he slept all day, would eat meager, disgusting beans from a can, and he would study and write, and that's what he did. And so he starts to go. The only thing that draws him from the reclusion is these amateur press associations. So basically, like little freelance, like do-it-yourself zines. And he starts finding like-minded people, and they wind up meeting in Boston. And there he meets Sonia Green, who 2 years later, no, 3 years later, would become his wife, which was at her behest, not at his, because he was very much a gentleman, and he did not think much of himself. So he did not think that he could ask for her hand in marriage. But they marry shortly after the death of his mother in Butler Hospital, which is which after he's really starting to get back into being happy and normal, his mother, who he had a strange and strong connection to, is she's killed. So after this, he moves to New York. Sonia moves to Cincinnati. He refuses to get a job, so he moves back to Providence. They divorce. He writes some really good stories, and then he dies from cancer. So that's pretty much his life, and it's agreed upon. He had some very strange eccentricities. Whenever he would leave the house, he would wear a very high-collared jacket with the flaps all the way up, and he would hold it together, and he would stare at the ground as if he was not trying to make eye contact with anyone. He would talk with a lilt sometimes. He was an extreme Anglophile, which was weird in early 20th century Boston, where, we revolted against them. So he was pretty racist. He kind of got better in the end, but not really. And he, in one lovely letter, he supported Nazism. This is before they knew about the genocide camps, but in much America did. So that's pretty much H.P. Lovecraft. He wrote some really amazing stories. Is a very checkered character at best, I guess. And he is, I find, to be terribly interesting. So that is pretty much the general biographical consensus that I also got from The Fear of the Unknown, a biographical film. And there are some more intensive sections in I Am Providence by S.T. Joshi, which is a written biography by a prominent scholar on the subject. But they pretty much portray that character. Oftentimes, Joshi calls into question, like, was Lovecraft accurate in thinking that he was of royal lineage and related to some Musgraves in England? No, but he didn't know that, and so those sorts of things are examined in how they affected how he thought of himself. So those are the first two biographies I examined. I also then moved into fictional portrayals of him. So I have one here. This is Harold Lovecraft and Tesla. It's a comic book. We can flip through it real quick. But you see, you got him there smoking a pipe. I want to say there's Tesla, and I don't know who that guy is. But yeah, so we definitely have a very interesting portrayal of him there. There's also the film Howard Lovecraft and the Frozen Kingdom, which is a 2013 children's film, PG-13. However, I personally wouldn't show it to a child because it, I almost watched it with my nephew, and I'm really glad I didn't. It starts off with a very moody, broody, emo-looking Lovecraft in this house with his worried, frail mother, and they are going to visit his father in the asylum. And when they go, there's a character, Dr. West, who is an obvious reference to H.P. Lovecraft's story Herbert West, Reanimator. That character takes them back to see her father, or his father, and there Lovecraft is grabbed by the coat and throttled around and yada yada yada. The monsters you're going to write about later in life are real, and you have to stop them. Blah, blah, blah. That's what his father howls at him. And, Lovecraft's monsters aren't real. They're fantasy. B, his father would never have been interested in those sorts of things, even if he was mad. see. He never went to the asylum to visit his father. He would never see his father again, and his father would die there alone. Uh, well, I think this had a great impact on Lovecraft, his fatherlessness, essentially, and the fact that his father was completely exiled by his son. I think did have a very strong impact on him. But this entire account, the character of this, moody, broody guy, that's that's kind of true, I guess. But the entire historical event is inaccurate. Harold, the comic book, it does great work tying Lovecraft to other great figures of his time, who he may have been peripherally connected to. So far, the only one is that he actually interacted with was Harry Houdini, and he ghost wrote for him. But the entire thing's character portrayal of him is inaccurate. It's terribly wrong. He's overconfident. He's presumptuous. He's aggressive. He's straightforward and to the point. When him and Nikola Tesla, who will partner up to save the world, when they meet up for the first time, Lovecraft shoves something into his hands, and he's like, "What do you think of it?" And he's like, "I can't understand it." And he's like, "It is perfect." And so in that moment, the character is not only full of himself, but he's like, "Look, this thing I'm good at is the best. I am awesome. This is great." When in all honesty, if you examine his marginalia, he constantly derails and degrades his own writing until he finds it in a state of near perfection but never perfection. So he doesn't think that of his writing. He would write 20-page analysis of his own work and other writers' work that he would then send back. He was one of the greatest literary critics, and if you are a writer, a good friend to know, because of that in-depth detail that is not very commonly found in modern age either. And so the character, like, not only is the historical stuff completely just fabricated nonsense, but the character is inaccurate. And so you're seeing one portrayal of him is kind of like a My Chemical Romance song, and then the other one is very much just this hyper nerd who's like, but also like a characteristic hero who just thinks he's the best. And it's really just not an accurate representation. The biography obviously has a really good representation because it examines the historical record, does that. But when examining Lovecraft as a single entity, what I found to be the most revealing was his own literature. And so have I marked the page? The stories that I'm going to include will be The Outsider and The Dunwich Horror. So before I can talk about these, I talked to you about his father and how that affected him, but I've not really talked about this negative relationship he had with his mother. So Lovecraft's mother really seemed to like her kid sometimes, and other times she was not as fond of him. And she would have a very bipolar tendency. Additionally, she had this very puritanical view of child rearing, so he never even hugged his mother, which is real weird, real strange. Can't be healthy for a kid's mind. So instead of that traditional maternal relationship, it doesn't really exist. And that's partly because it wasn't heavily recorded by him because it was obviously negative. During his reclusive depressive episode, he would not leave the house, and he was only awake at night, so if he did, it'd be at night. And if he did, it'd be at night, he'd have his trench coat with the big flaps pulled tightly around him, staring forward and walking swiftly like he did not want any social interaction. And yet he was shocked that people wouldn't talk to him. So a neighbor asked, "Why haven't I seen your son out and around?" Because when he was going to school, she saw him every day. And his mother says, oh, he doesn't come outside during the day because he's particularly hideous. That's something that's recorded from the neighbor about his mother. So that's not like Lovecraft being like, look, my mom hates me. It's actually in the historical record. So she was not a great parent. So you have a character who enters into a reclusion, then he exits to find the world, think he's hideous. Have I just described the story I just told you, or have I described the plot of The Outsider? Because the answer is yes. The Outsider is a story about a character who goes into a lofty reclusion, then loses track of time, then comes out and finds a fleeing village, and then he looks in a mirror, and alas, it is he who is driving them away, because of his particularly terrible visage. It's a beautiful story. It's wonderful. It's only 6 pages, one of his shorter works. So I found that to be really revealing, that if I want a good historical representation of Lovecraft, the autobiography isn't enough. I need the autobiography where he is using his own experiences and that he doesn't feel comfortable with. There's a poet who said that sometimes poetry is a space to do something that maybe you don't know what it is, or maybe you don't know how to deal with it. And in this moment, we have him using The Outsider as a space to come to terms with this. And I think that's a lot of his literature is founded in his own strict universal psyche, or individual psyche, as it were. And it's used to deal with these traumas, which is very similar to Bastard Out of Carolina. So my voice got real weird there. So the next one is The Dunwich Horror, which is a good one. So I just want to show you how many pages it is, because I think it is definitely about one of these personal traumas. So The Dunwich Horror is a lovely story. It's one of his longer pieces, and it is this big. And it is the story of Wilbur Whatley. So now, to review, Lovecraft's father goes insane, leaves him. He moves in with the maternal grandfather and mother, and there he's educated in a private library. Okay, so Wilbur Whatley's story is that he is of unknown fatherage, right? He has a mother, but no one in the town of Dunwich knows his dad. The father that he really gets is the maternal grandfather, and it is after a while that Wilbur is, well, he gets real weird, right? And so he starts getting educated by these things. The grandfather dies, and the doctor who is there says that, like, he said some real weird stuff about stuff, and it's not really sure, not really clear. But Wilbert seems to get it. And then Wilbert, and they are also like doing witch Sabbaths up on Sentinel Hill, where the Native Americans used to kill people and sacrifice them to some old god. So, but that's not really important. What's important is that there is an obvious connection between Wilbert and Lovecraft. So Wilbert is raised in the same house that Lovecraft was. He has no father, like Lovecraft had no father. There's a myriad parallels that I don't need to explain them all. The part that then gets interesting in the first major section, which is what's considered the prologue to the horror, is that Wilbert dies. Wilbert is attacked by a dog, and he is eaten alive, but some of his body remains. And at this point, the dog has shred all cloth, so he is laid bare. Above the waist, it was semi-anthropomorphic, though its chest had leathery reticulated hide of a crocodile or alligator. The back was piebald, dimly suggested certain snakes. Below the waist, though, it was the worst, for here all human semblance left off, and sheer fantasy began. The skin was thickly covered with coarse black fur, and from the abdomen a score of long greenish-gray tentacles with red-sucking mouth protruded limply. On each of the hips, deeply set in a kind of pinkish, scintillated orbit, was what seemed to be a rudimentary eye. And the section ends with, he had taken somewhat after his unknown father. Okay, so this sheds a lot of light on how Lovecraft felt about his father, because his father was literally an unknown alien entity. The 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 story that then happens to summate is that the character's grandfather made a deal with an ancient evil god called Yog-Sothoth, and he basically agreed to prostitute out his daughter so it could have a child or children. Wilbert dies, but they reference this thing that they're like making in the attic, and it is this monstrosity called a shoggoth, and they are about the size of a barn. They're invisible unless you spray like a certain powder on them, and then they're kind of briefly visible, but it's literally just a giant mound of tentacles, mouths, and eyes. That's it. So, and it, eventually it gets sent back to whatever hell place it was from, but it drives some people insane who see it. It's a real bad time for everybody involved. Some people kill themselves after having seen it. It's just wonderful. But we have this twin, this fraternal figure that is being presented. And so if we know that Wilbert is a reflection of Lovecraft, and we know that this is also a product of this maddening relationship with his father, we can understand that this might be a representation of his own creativity or his own where he's generating these ideas from. But it might also be another reflection of how he viewed himself, that there is one part of him that was this disgusting semi thing, and then there's this thing that is just complete unknown. I think that those two stories, when you look at them in that context, it shows you a lot more about how he viewed himself as a figure, and how in his own stories he would discuss how he thought of himself. So that's what I thought to be really, really interesting, and that's kind of what I gained from it. Additional sources I used, I wanted to examine the role of an author, so I looked at Michel Foucault, French literary philosopher's essay, What is an Author?, and talks about author function and how it affects society and the cultural, like how it is used to discuss the culture around it. I also examined Roland Barthes, another French literary essayist, his essay, The Death of the Author, and what I found from it is it said that we need to move towards postmodernism where the author is completely dissociated from the text, but I found that if you did that with Lovecraft, you would lose so much. It becomes much more beautiful knowing that relationship. That's overall my project in examining representation of literary icon. So thank you very much. I really appreciate the time that you all took to watch this. So have a good day.